A second sun rose over Japan that morning. Not a dawn, not mercy, but a new, blinding light that erased the world for a moment and then remade it into something none of the people beneath it had ever seen. That image is where this story begins, with a flash so bright it was mistaken for the real sun, with two lives in different hemispheres moving toward the same instant, and with a seriousness that history still struggles to hold in plain sight. It was August of 1945. Europe had surrendered months earlier. A vast war machine was turning its attention to the Pacific. In Washington and Los Angeles, planners and scientists had worked in secrecy for years to build a weapon the world had never known. In Tokyo and in cities across Japan, families had learned to sleep in blackouts, to carry the small false comforts of food and radio, to live under air raid warnings and the constant possibility of invasion. The Allies faced a hard calculation. An amphibious invasion of the Japanese home islands, Operation Downfall, promised casualties on a scale that haunted military estimates. Those projections helped shape a decision that would take place in secrecy, high above the island of Honshu, and would be executed by ordinary men who had been ordered to perform an extraordinary task. We will follow two threads through these days. One is the view from above, a pilot identified in our sources as Paul Tibbets, a commander chosen to deliver a weapon whose existence was compartmentalized even within the Air Force that flew it. He would fly a B-29 bomber carrying an instrument of such newness that even its mechanics required improvisation, mid-air arming procedures, the hush of a crew sworn to silence. The other thread is from the ground, a boy in Hiroshima, named in the source as Sada Hirano, 12 years old, a child whose rituals of school, chores, play, and apprentice work were ordinary in every sense until they were not. These two lives, the one trained for precision at 10,000 feet and the one growing up in a city of wooden houses and river markets, moved toward a single converging point in the sky. The weapon itself was the result of a secret the size of a nation. For nearly 3 years, scientists had bent physics into a means of war. Machines and metallurgy, mathematics and secrecy combined to create an explosive power freed from the bounds of previous ordnance. By late July, the first test, an experiment in a remote desert, had shown the potential of what the project had wrought. That success, however distant, set the timetable. The military planners who had feared millions of casualties in an invasion now saw an alternative that might spare some of the bloodshed of a prolonged land campaign. The calculus took place in briefings and memos, behind locked doors and with maps on tabletops.
It was a cold arithmetic, mixed with the urgency of a war they wanted to end. Back on Tinian Island in the Pacific, the airbase became a world unto itself, a place of wire fences and strict clearances, of crews who practiced procedures until the motions hid the meanings. There, within a maintenance hangar, stood the aircraft that would become infamous, a B-29 named Enola Gay, painted with a tidy designation, painted as the story passed among the men, after the pilot's mother. The name was Domestic, the small human counterpoint to the enormous technology that would ride under her wings. Paul Tibbets, the man the sources point to as the one chosen to take that aircraft to its target, lived in the tension between banality and historic consequence. He was a professional airman, a commander whose life until that summer had been shaped by training schedules, mechanical checks, and the small, almost comforting rituals that make a crew cohere, sharing sandwiches in the cabin before takeoff, joking in clipped tones about weather and altimeters, checking each other's oxygen masks. The crew trained under orders to talk little, to avoid curiosity about what lay beneath the bomb bay when the plane left the airfield. Secrecy had a way of normalizing itself. Men who had flown many long missions learned to keep the unsayable out of dinner conversations. On the ground in Hiroshima, Sada's world was neither secretive nor conspiratorial. It was a life organized around school bells and hand-me-down clothes, around the smell of miso and firewood, around the work assigned to boys in a city preparing itself for the kind of destruction it knew only by rumor. Civil defense work was a part of daily life. Men and women pulled down thatch and timber, crews pried apart eaves and stored sandbags, communities practiced drills meant to keep fires from joining into a single, unstoppable inferno. Children learned to avoid windows during sirens and to carry the faint stoicism of rationing. They learned how to fold their futons for rapid exits and where to go when the air raid warning sounded. These routines, avionic checklists in a tin hangar and demolition crews in narrow streets, moved toward a morning Tidits could not know would change the world, and a boy in Hiroshima who would later say, many times, that his normal morning began with the same small, private thoughts any child has: hunger, friends, the small pleasures available in wartime. He did not know the world had shifted in laboratories and policy rooms. He only lived inside the city until the day it did not hold. Day to day for the crew: start the motors, taxi, climb, fly, and when the mission permitted, share a makeshift meal and a laugh that touched only the edges of their faces. Training included the unusual: procedures for carrying a device that, until then, existed more as a schematic in secure files than as a cargo manifest.
Bomb technicians had devised a way to arm the weapon in flight, a method born of the fear that a fully assembled device on the ground might be a risk the base could not accept. The result was a choreography of secrecy. The pilot would take off with a safe, incomplete package, and somewhere over the ocean, a small team would complete the arming. In their hands, both the mundane and the monstrous sat side by side, a sandwich wrapper and a manual of safety procedures. At the same time, within Hiroshima's neighborhoods, ordinary people argued in low voices about what the future held. Some said the Americans would come with conventional bombing. Others whispered about new technologies, rumored to be so terrible they could level whole cities from the sky. People made small adaptations, shifting belongings to stone cellars, huddling under bridges in the rain, tending to the elderly whose bodies had been hollowed by shortages. The city's river was both a place of work and a place of refuge. It would soon become a scene repeated in many testimonies: people seeking water for parched throats, for cooling, for comforting the burned. Back on Tinian, mission planners paced through the details. Flight paths were rehearsed, support planes and photographic aircraft indexed and assigned. The navigator mapped a course that hugged islands in shadow, that used weather as cover and clarity as a target for photography. The Enola Gay's crew practiced radio silence. Even the smallest mistakes, men were told, could cascade into disaster in a mission that could change the face of the war. There is a strain of human behavior that the archives capture again and again: the banality of duty. The men who flew the B-29s were, in many cases, ordinary people executed into extraordinary time. Their letters home, when they existed, often focused on the weather or the food. That morning, as the engines warmed, one of the crew folded his sandwich wrapper, tucked it into a pocket as if it were a lucky charm, and ran through a pre-flight checklist he had recited 1,000 times. It was a ritual that turned a stomach knot into a muscle memory. In Hiroshima, the city's morning was ordinary in every way a morning can be ordinary. Sada walked with other boys to a riverbank, the sky bright with humidity. Children practiced blackouts in school drills, making the small wrongness of ordinary life visible, the way a town could sink into the habitual fear of an alarm. Sada's family may have argued over the ration of rice for the week. They may have joked about a neighbor's stubborn cat. These are the details that distance biographies from myth, real people living routine lives until the extraordinary makes routine impossible. As the preparations tightened, secrecy became layered. For the crew, only a handful knew the final target that morning.
For the technicians who would arm the device, procedures were reviewed in hushed gatherings, manuals consulted with a gravity that came from understanding what might happen if one step failed. The weapon, small enough to be carried by a single bomber, yet potent beyond anything the world had used in war, had components that required expertise. Men had to trust one another across that trust's narrowness. The pilot trusted his technicians, the technicians trusted their instruments, the entire mission trusted that the calculations done in a desert test would scale to a city below. In retrospective accounts, officers sometimes described the emotional mismatch that came with such a mission. You could be a man who had been promoted for technical skill and leadership, and then find yourself excused from the kind of revelry that might mark a successful sortie. They wore medals later, posed before cameras, and kept a steady voice when giving statements. Still, the night before the flight, some confessed to restless sleep. Others, perhaps, simply did what soldiers always do: focus on the next checklist, the next instrument, the next call. On the other side, the ways people prepared for danger were modest and human. A neighbor might leave a bowl of water in the shade for cooling. Women would wrap bandages carefully, as if at any moment the city might be called into improvisatory triage. The small devices of care, wrapped herbs, extra layers, a child's favorite toy tied up against dust, were the last private acts that would, for many, become relics. The Enola Gay lifted in the early morning light, heavy with fuel and secrecy. Other aircraft from the 509th Composite Group followed or accompanied, each with its mission: weather reconnaissance, photographic documentation, support. They climbed to altitude, met the currents at 10,000 feet and higher, and settled into a formation that made them a small, moving armada.
On board, the tone was a study in contrasts. The cabin hummed with instruments and radio static, and yet men traded jokes to keep the air light. Discipline and gallows humor walked together. For the technicians who would arm the device after takeoff, the process had been rehearsed in the small, intense way military crews rehearse anything, over and over so that muscle remembers what the mind cannot say aloud. The bomb itself, referred to in shorthand by the men as Little Boy in the documents our sources supply, was a cylinder of components that required a certain sequence. The sequence performed in flight was mechanical and final. On the ground, it would have been a liability. In the air, it became a manageable risk. The men clipped straps, checked seals, spoke terse words across the cabin, and moved with a calm that came from training in the face of risk. Meanwhile, in Hiroshima, the morning sun climbed into a sky that would not be the last light many of the city's inhabitants ever saw.
Traders opened stalls along riverbanks, laundry hung in courtyards, and children chased each other through narrow alleys, the noise of their play registering in the warm air. The city had been scarred by years of resource shortage and night raids, but it remained a city of businesses, of families, of mundane human exchanges. Nothing about its skyline suggested the scale of what would intersect it from above. The flight's approach toward Japan was a lesson in the collision of the ordinary and the catastrophic. Pilots and navigators, trained for precision, studied charts and timed their runs in minutes and seconds. Weather reports were combed, winds were factored, cloud cover was evaluated. For these men, the mission was a disciplined exercise of timing and humanity, masked by machinery. They were professionals performing a duty. The aircraft's bomb bay, when opened, exposed the small cylindrical package, an unassuming silhouette against a sky filled with potential. As the bomber neared its target, the technicians inside prepared to complete the final steps that would make the device function as intended. The arming process was not glamorous. It involved moving components into place, confirming electrical connections, and, at a certain point, acknowledging that the weapon could no longer be rendered inert without catastrophic loss. Men spoke in clipped terms, because the culture of radio silence and operational security had made them careful with vocabulary. Outside, the air moved. The earth below was a tapestry of streets and roofs, and the crew sat inside a physics that had become judgment. On the streets of Hiroshima, the day moved on. People noticed the plane noise that came and went in those war-torn years, engines high in the sky, the sound of a world beyond sight. They sometimes tracked contrails with a child's curiosity, sometimes with the wary eye of the experienced. That morning, no one on the ground knew to expect what would follow. Some people glanced upward and went back to their lives. The ordinary has a stubbornness to it. Habits and small comforts proceed until they do not. When the last checks were made, when the canopy of the aircraft cut silently against the morning, the instrument that separated safety from activation was moved. A wrench or a lever, the specific was a matter of technical manuals and careful hands, was turned into place. For those inside the plane, this must have been a moment that narrowed the world to a few feet of metal and the small electrical hum of systems that promised to do something no one had done in war before. Up on the plane, one crewman later recalled the strange intimacy of the moment. A hand on a lever, a confirmation check, the exchange of a terse phrase that meant the device was now armed. There was no applause. There was only the mechanical note of systems confirming alignment. For the men, there was a sense of finality that could not be undone by will. The rest was a matter of timing and fall. Below, Sada and the other children may have been returning from errands or from the river, laughing in a way that felt like the small rebellion of youth against the heavy world. A teacher may have been dictating lessons. A father might have been arranging a small repair. Those acts of domestic life, the tying of a child's sandal, the sweeping of a porch, were ordinary until they were not. The last minutes before release are the kind of scene that unspools differently in every recollection. For the crew, it is instrument dials and sighting. For those on the ground, it is the brightening of a sky that cannot be explained by cloud or sun. For a brief suspended interval, both worlds exist in parallel, men with charts in the cockpit and families on the ground, both unaware of how their narratives will bind together. Then, in the air, the moment of drop came. The device left the bomb bay and began its fall. 44 seconds is the figure that recurs in eyewitness and technical accounts, a measured interval between release and the irreversible. For the men above, those seconds were taut with duty and training. For the people below,
they would be forever compressed into a flash that made time feel both infinitely wide and instantly over. What happened in those seconds is part technical fact and part human witness. The bomb fell through layers of sky, picked up acceleration and speed, and crossed the distance between a plane and a city in less time than some crosswalks take. For the crew, it was a procedural moment. For the men on support planes, the photographic and observation crews that had been assigned, it was the instant to prepare cameras, record data, and mark a new kind of history. On the ground, eyewitnesses later recounted a light that overran everything. It was described as brighter than any midday sun, a white heat that removed definition, a color that seared eyes and memory more than skin. People later told of being thrown backward by a force that carried the air like a hand. Clothing and skin reacted in ways that survivors would find impossible to unsee. The world shifted from familiar textures of wood and paper to a blast of heat that consumed surfaces in a fraction of a second. Those who later spoke of the moment often did so as if the world had become a painting in which the plane and the fire were both abstract. One recollection might emphasize the sound, a thunder that arrived after the light, while another would linger on the silence that followed for a breath, a moment in which people could not name what had happened because no language contained it yet. People reached for relatives and found only heat and smoke. Children searching for parents found streets changed into rivers of debris. In the cabin of the Enola Gay and in the supporting aircraft, the men watched their instruments and the sky. They were trained to observe, to register data, to report.
Some later testified to a feeling of professional detachment. Others admitted to a quietness that had nothing to do with military discipline and everything to do with the human sense of having witnessed something that moved beyond usual categories of success or failure. Their mission had been executed. The world beneath them had changed. In those first moments, neither side could fully grasp the scale of consequences. Smoke rose where roofs had been, and where bodies had once walked, there were now shadows on the pavement. Images later described as silhouettes permanently marked onto surfaces by heat intense enough to change the chemical bonds of materials. Rivers, once sources of life and commerce, became bearers of the dead and the dying who sought cool water that would not stop the internal injuries they carried. Fires, started by heat and ruptured fuel, began to spread through neighborhoods of wood and paper, turning streets into channels of flame. But the full meaning of what had occurred could not be seen from any one vantage point in those first seconds. For the men in the air, the mission remained a set of actions taken under orders and procedures. For survivors, it was a rupture whose reverberations would be measured in wounds, in the sudden absence of neighbors, in the collapse of services, and in the days of suffering to come. The single event stitched together by the physics of an explosive device would produce human consequences that multiplied and persisted, resisting neat accounting. At the end of those 44 seconds and in the breath that followed, the world had been altered in a way that would take generations to measure. But in the immediate arc, there were also paradoxes. Men who received commendations and medals, while families below searched for loved ones. Scientists who watched data scroll on instruments, and who later wrestled with moral complexity. Neighbors who found themselves caregivers amid ruins, turning their small stores into aid for strangers whose names they would never know. The morning that began with a second sun had now crossed the threshold between action and consequence. The crew that had flown the plane and the boy who had been walking the city's streets were both caught in the same arc, one looking back across an ocean toward a base where medals and reporting would follow, the other looking around at a city that had become a landscape of immediate needs and unanswered questions. Neither perspective could fully encompass the other, and that incompleteness is where untold stories nest, in the places where facts are known, but meaning is still being gathered, where lists of casualties strain against the reality of individual suffering. There was in the hours after the drop a kind of bureaucratic choreography that begins under war conditions. Aircraft reported to base, photographs were processed, orders went out. Some men were debriefed and praised.
At the same time, in hospitals that had not been built for this scale of trauma, doctors improvised, nurses worked beyond exhaustion, mothers gathered what remained of children and searched alleys for neighbors. Those small acts of reporting, of tending, of hiding grief beneath a practiced calm are the human motion that history sometimes reduces to numbers. Numbers, in fact, are a slippery language here. Contemporary and later estimates of deaths, immediate and delayed, vary. Sources place the cumulative toll in ranges that acknowledge uncertainty. Estimates often used in historical accounts range widely and are contested. The data we hold are incomplete because the ability to record and to account collapses amid catastrophe. That uncertainty is itself a part of the untold story, the difference between the record and lived experience, between policy papers and the fragments of bone, clothing, and memory that survivors carried. When a government makes a decision to use a weapon never used in combat before, there are two kinds of calculation: the arithmetic of strategy and the arithmetic of human lives. The strategists tally projected casualties, weigh timelines and logistics. The human arithmetic, the grief of mothers, the burns that will not heal, the cancers that will appear years later, falls into a different category altogether. Those numbers are not simply statistics. They are the steady, crushing count of consequences that unfold in hospitals, in orphaned children, in the long silence of survivors who return to ruins and to memories that cannot be turned off. As the hours and then the day stretched out, the people of Hiroshima who survived the initial flash and blast began what would become the long work of survival and recovery. Some walked, dazed and burned, to any source of water. Some fashioned stretchers from doors and tatami mats. Others sought to identify the dead. Many could not be recognized. For the crew that had dropped the device, the mission debriefs and the public communications began to form a different narrative, one that spoke in terms of mission success and geopolitical consequence. In private, some of those men later said they felt an unease that obedience and discipline did not erase. The contrast between celebration and grief would become one of the defining moral tensions of this moment in history. On airbases, parades of documentation and commendations. In ruined cities, the slow calculus of rescue. There is an ethical pressure here that resists easy resolution. The question of whether a single act described as strategic can be separated from the human suffering produced by the act. Historians will debate motives and consequences, and witnesses will tell their stories, and numbers will be tallied in ranges that always carry the qualifier of uncertainty.
The untold story we want to hold is the human thread that runs through those debates. The men who carried out orders, the technicians who performed precise tasks, the children who died in classrooms, the neighbors who hauled bodies into the river because there was nowhere else to put them. As night fell on that first day of a new kind of warfare, the airbase on Tinian prepared for the long haul of reporting and publicity that would follow. The men who had flown would sleep in their bunks and wake to interviews, to orders, to a world that would now carry knowledge of their mission. In Hiroshima, survivors kindled tiny fires to keep warm in house frames that stood like skeletons, and they began, at least in some small way, to count the living. The day had begun with an ordinary light and an ordinary routine. It ended with the knowledge that some things, once done, cannot be undone. This is where our first part of the story pauses its march. We have followed two lives to the point where a decision, made far from a city, intersects a child's horizon. We have seen the ritual of military discipline meet the texture of ordinary life, and we have watched a single instrument of war fall through the sky and changed everything it touched. What follows, the scale of human suffering, the decisions that led to a second detonation 3 days later, the surrender, and the long historical reckonings, belongs to the next chapters of this narrative. For now, we hold that bright, terrible morning and the people who lived through it in our memory, because it is in the remembering that the untold begins to be known. If you want more eyewitness history told this way, subscribe and ring the bell. Hours after that terrible light, the world divided its work between counting and caring. On Tinian, reports were filed, photographs were developed, and the men who had carried out the mission moved through a protocol of duty, debriefings, orders, and the public language of military success. In the city below, the work was less procedural and more elemental, finding water, covering burns, moving bodies. Those two kinds of labor would shape how the event was remembered, one in memos and medal citations, the other in scars, in names, and in mornings that would never again feel safe. Back at base, the pilot identified in our source as Paul Tibbets, name presented in the source, spelling as given, walked through a corridor that now contained history.
Men clustered around radios and film strips, trying to translate images into a language that could be sent back to Washington without flattening the human cost. Photographs were proof, and proof needed captions, and captions soon became part of a wider narrative. Mission accomplished, a new instrument of war employed. Yet in private accounts, many of the men spoke later of an ambiguity that could not be filed away. The flight had been executed with precision, and precision did not eliminate a different register of feeling.
Some described a quiet that followed their professional elation, a kind of hush that hinted at understanding rather than celebration. For Sada Hirano, named in the source as Sada Hirano, spelling possibly transcribed differently, the days that followed were measured in small, brutal necessities. He and the other survivors stumbled through a city that had been transformed into a ruin of roofs and ash. They sought water not because they were thirsty in the ordinary sense, but because the heat and the burns demanded it. People tried to cool flayed skin with river water and crushed ice. They bound wounds with whatever cloth was available. They wrapped the dying in anything that could hide exposed tissue from the eyes of strangers. Hospitals, limited already by wartime shortages, filled beyond capacity. Staff improvised. They cut tatami mats into stretchers, turned temples and schools into ad hoc wards, and taught untrained volunteers how to cool burns or feed the delirious. The range of human injuries was wide, and for many survivors invisible at first. The immediate physical traumas, severe burns, broken bones from collapsing timber and masonry, lacerations, were the most evident. But a second wave of suffering arrived in the following days and weeks, radiation-related injuries, whose logic the sufferers often did not at first comprehend. Some patients developed fevers and hair loss. Others showed blood abnormalities that physicians struggled to attribute within their existing knowledge. In interviews and recollections gathered in later years, survivors recounted the bewilderment of being told that a light had done this, light that had not burned like gasoline, that had seared in a way that ordinary fire did not. Information was partial and often contradictory. The city's infrastructure had collapsed in many parts, water mains ripped, supply chains broken, communications unreliable. Rescue teams searched through rubble using hands because there was nothing else. People improvised funeral rites when coffins could not be had. The social rituals of mourning, prayers, gatherings, the exchange of condolences, became improvised acts of grace in the middle of a logistical nightmare. For many families, the loss was total. Fathers, mothers, children gone in a single instant. For others, loss arrived in increments, as loved ones succumbed to injuries in days and weeks after the blast. News of what had happened moved through military and political channels with a speed that belid the physical realities on the ground. In Washington, at Los Alamos, in London and Tokyo, leaders read reports and looked at photographs. For scientists who had followed the project from theoretical equations to the desert test months earlier, there was, in some cases, a dawning moral reckoning. Those who had measured yields and recorded blast radii now had to confront the human faces that appeared in the images. The data, numbers, distances, temperatures, met bodies.
Some voices among the scientific community began to question the use of such a device in war, or at least to wrestle publicly and privately with the implications. Others defended the action as a strategic choice made in an extraordinary moment. The debate would become, in the months and years ahead, a deeply contested portion of the historical record. Meanwhile, 3 days later, another aircraft left Tinian carrying a different device, known in the mission files as Fat Man, a design distinct from the first. The second detonation, on August 9th, struck Nagasaki. The circumstances around the target selection, weather, and aiming involve operational details that remain complex and in some accounts indefinite. What is clear is that another city, with its people and its routines, experienced a second catastrophic explosion in a week. The human consequences of that second blow compounded the shock of the first. More dead, more injured, more families shattered, in a country already reeling. Across both cities, attempts to count the dead proved difficult and imprecise. Contemporary and later historians work with fragmented data, registers lost in fires, family members missing and presumed dead, records corrupted by the chaos of wartime collapse. Estimates of cumulative deaths, immediate and delayed, are typically expressed as ranges rather than exact totals. Many reputable accounts place the combined toll for Hiroshima and Nagasaki in the decades after the war within a range that frequently appears in sources, roughly 150,000 to 250,000 deaths, with the precise number remaining uncertain and debated among scholars. Those figures attempt to account for initial fatalities,
those who died in the weeks and months after from injuries and acute effects, and those whose deaths decades later were linked to radiation-related illnesses. Yet no collection of numbers can fully capture the loss of the individual face, the voice, the father, the friend. For survivors, life after the blasts was lived in a new temporality. Physical healing was one endeavor, the social and psychological work of reintegration was another. Many survivors, those whose bodies bore scars and whose families had been decimated, found themselves stigmatized in subtle and painful ways. Employers and prospective spouses sometimes hesitated. Rumors about contagion or heredity circulated in a climate of fear and ignorance. Children born in later years were often the subject of social anxiety, with communities unsure how to interpret the health risks. Over time, medical studies would document elevated rates of certain illnesses in exposed populations, but for individuals living through the aftermath in the 1940s and 1950s, certainty was rare and rumors frequent. This social dimension of suffering, the way communities struggled to know how to welcome back or care for survivors, became part of the long shadow cast by those days.
On naval and air bases, men who had returned from the missions were sometimes celebrated and awarded. The tension between official recognition and private conscience remained a persistent theme. Some crew members embraced their medals as simply the military's way of recording duty performed. Others later expressed unease, recognizing that commendation and grief coexisted uneasily. Scientists, too, navigated this moral landscape. Some who had labored on the Manhattan Project advocated for strict controls on nuclear weapons in the post-war period, arguing that the technology demanded international safeguards. Others accepted the military and political logic that had led to the bomb's use. The conversation about responsibility, oversight, and ethics among scientists would help shape early discussions about arms control in the years to come. In Japan, leadership faced its own agonized calculus. The devastation of the cities, the collapse of infrastructure, and the terror the bombs created pressed on political and military decision-making. Within the government and the imperial court, voices debated whether to surrender, continue resistance, or seek terms that preserved honor. Historians continue to examine the relative weight of the atomic bombings, the Soviet Union's entry into the war against Japan, the state of Japan's military situation, and internal political dynamics. What is clear from contemporary records is that the combination of catastrophic damage and geopolitical pressures produced an outcome. Japan announced its intention to surrender a few days later. Many historians argue that this surrender was the result of multiple factors, military, diplomatic, and humanitarian, and not solely the consequence of any single event. That multiplicity of causes does not lessen the extraordinary nature of the atomic attacks. It complicates the question of motive and effect, making it, in scholarly terms, an area of informed debate rather than settled explanation. Years after the war, survivors organized to demand recognition, medical care, and social support. They told their stories in public forums, at memorials, and in petitions. The faces and voices of those who had lived through the blasts became a crucial thread in the broader narrative. Not anonymous statistics, but living witnesses whose testimonies carried the moral force of experience. Memorials and museums in the destroyed cities preserved fragments of ruins and artifacts as testimony, and annual commemorations gathered crowds who sought to remember and to plead for a future with such weapons. The cities themselves would eventually rebuild. Streets were paved, buildings rose again, and new generations were born into landscapes reshaped by violence and recovery. Yet the memory of what happened was never fully archived away. It persisted in the national psyche, in survivor testimony, and in debates about how technology, secrecy, and warfare intersect.
For many residents who returned to rebuilt neighborhoods, the act of living on the same ground where the unthinkable had happened became an act of defiance and of duty, to remember the dead by caring for the living and by ensuring that memorials and museums taught successive generations what the world had once allowed. On an individual level, Sada, like others whose childhood had been interrupted, would carry the consequences for a lifetime. The physical scars, the loss of family, the memory of voices silenced in an instant, and the long periods of illness and uncertainty molded a person shaped by absence. Decades later, when asked about that morning, many survivors described a mix of grief and a steady insistence to tell the story accurately, to insist on the names and faces behind any statistic. That insistence formed the moral core of the untold story, that remembrance must be rooted in testimony, not only in numbers.
Internationally, the bombings precipitated another chapter in human history, the nuclear age. Technology that had once been the province of labs and desert tests now became a central axis of military and diplomatic strategy. The Cold War, arms races, and eventual non-proliferation efforts grew out of the fact that the destructive power demonstrated in 1945 could be magnified and distributed. The calculation that had once pitted an invasion's projected casualties against the choice to use a novel weapon evolved into an era where nations weighed deterrence, doctrine, and humanitarian risk. The moral and political debates that followed the war about control, testing, and disarmament began in part as direct responses to the images and testimonies that emerged from Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That legacy has two sides: technological mastery and moral responsibility. The engineers and physicists who had solved the technical problem of a chain reaction also left behind a legacy of ethical questions about what such knowledge makes possible and what societies should permit. Some scientists devoted their later energies to arms control advocacy and international frameworks intended to limit proliferation. Others focused on the discipline of science and its civic obligations. The public conversation about nuclear weapons shifted, in part because survivors came forward and demanded that their stories be heard in policy circles. Yet despite decades of diplomacy, treaties, and public education, the underlying reality remains. The destructive capacity humanity discovered in 1945 has been amplified since then. That is not an argument about precise numbers or a claim about inevitability. It is a qualitative observation grounded in the simple fact that technologies have evolved. The moral imperative that arises from this fact is also simple. Remembrance must be active.
To remember is not only to recount a date or a statistic, but to hold in public memory the faces and voices of those who did not choose the logic of war that found them beneath that second sun. There is, in addition, a more personal moral of uncanny clarity. The men who carried out orders were not monsters in the ordinary sense. Many were professionals, pilots, technicians, scientists, whose lives before and after the mission contained ordinary human things: family dinners, letters, laughter over cigarettes. Their ordinariness complicates moral narratives that try to reduce actions to single explanations. The same is true for the civilians. They were not mere symbol or statistic, but people with whose daily practices history collided. That complexity is what gives the untold story its urgency. It resists simple condemnations and easy justifications, and instead asks us to hold the full tension, the competence of those who operated the weapon and the irreducible dignity of those who suffered under it. Remembering, then, becomes an ethical practice. It means listening to survivors, preserving their testimonies, acknowledging the ambiguity of wartime decisions without erasing human consequences, and ensuring that memorials insist on a particular duty: never to let the technology of destruction become banal. Memory is not just a private act, it is public pedagogy. It teaches new generations the stakes of secrecy and the human cost of decisions made behind closed doors. The untold aspects of the story, the small domestic details, the names of children, the bureaucratic minutes which record mission accomplished while a city burned, are the pieces that resist erasure by abstraction. As the decades passed, those who had been spared in body, but not in loved ones or memory, took up the work of advocacy. They sought recognition, medical care, and social acceptance. They gathered in parks and at memorials on anniversaries, read lists of names, and demanded that history keep them at its heart. Internationally, their voices became part of a chorus calling for limits on the most terrible weapons humanity can make. That chorus influenced policy debates, helped create institutions aimed at arms control, and kept the question of morality active in scientific and political communities. Our title frames this as an untold story, but the truth of untoldness is not that nothing is known. Rather, it is that what matters most is sometimes relegated to footnotes: the small domestic acts, the radio recordings of a child's voice, the list of makeshift wards that saved strangers in the hours after the blast. To tell these details is to insist on human scale, in a history that can otherwise be dwarfed by strategy and technology. In the end, the imperative is simple and grave. The events of August 1945 are not ancient curiosities, they are warnings.
They show what happens when secrecy, calculated risk, and technological capacity combined without a public moral imagination large enough to hold their consequences.
They also show the extraordinary resilience and dignity of people who rebuilt lives from ruins and who demanded that the world learn what they had lost. If you carry away one image from this story, let it be the human face behind every estimate. The child who reached for a parent and found nothing. The medic who cut tatami into stretchers. The pilot who carried out an order and lived afterward with its echo. The survivor who told their story so that others might understand. We must remember their names, their faces, and their testimonies, because remembering is an act that matters to the future. If this story moved you, remember the victims. Subscribe for more untold histories and share your thoughts below.